For years, Western analysts have obsessed over Japan's demographic decline. Meanwhile, they've missed the real story unfolding right next door. A demographic apocalypse in China that makes Japan's situation look like a masterclass in successful adaptation. While pundits drone on about Japanese ghost villages and falling birth rates, China is experiencing a population collapse so severe, so sudden, and so poorly managed that it threatens to unravel the entire Communist Party's grip on power. And unlike Japan, China doesn't have the luxury of time, wealth, or social cohesion to weather the storm. Let me be clear, this isn't about partisanship. This is about understanding the single most important geopolitical shift of the 21st century. China's demographic crisis isn't just an internal problem. It's going to reshape global power dynamics, supply chains, and the entire balance of the Indo-Pacific. And we need to stop treating it like just another economic statistic. Here's what you need to understand. China's official fertility rate stands at 1.0 births per woman. That's already catastrophic. But if you think the Chinese Communist Party is giving us accurate numbers, I have a bridge in Wuhan to sell you. Independent demographers estimate the real number is closer to zero point 0.7 or zero point 0.8, putting China in the same death spiral as South Korea, which currently holds the dubious honor of being the world's lowest fertility rate. For context, the replacement rate, the level needed to maintain a stable population, is 2.1. China isn't even halfway there. Do the math. At a fertility rate of 0.7, each generation is roughly one-third the size of the previous one. We're not talking about gradual decline here. We're talking about the most populous nation on Earth potentially halving its population within a single generation. This isn't a gentle slope. It's falling off a cliff. And here's the kicker. Japan hits its demographic inflection point in the 1990s, when it was already a wealthy, developed nation with the highest GDP per capita in the world. China is hitting the same wall with a GDP per capita that's still a fraction of Japan's. Beijing is getting old before it gets rich. The nightmare scenario every developing country fears. Let's talk about what demographers call the dependency ratio, the proportion of working-age adults to children and elderly. This is where China's problems become existential. By 2040, China will have roughly 400 million people over the age of 65. That's more than the entire population of the United States. These aren't healthy, active seniors like in Japan, a point I'll return to shortly. These are people who will need care, pensions, and healthcare in a country with a social safety net that makes America's look generous. Who's going to support them? The shrinking workforce, that's who. The working-age population in China has already peaked and is now in decline. Every year, fewer workers have to support more retirees. The inverted pyramid isn't theoretical anymore, it's here, and it's accelerating. Japan faced the same challenge, but here's the critical difference. Japanese workers are productive, well-educated, and supported by world-class automation and robotics. The average Chinese worker is not even close. China's labor productivity is still a fraction of developed nations, and the CCP's stranglehold on innovation means that gap isn't closing anytime soon. This is where the comparison to Japan becomes really damning. Japan doesn't just have old people, it has healthy old people. The concept that matters here is health-adjusted life expectancy, or a HALE. It measures not just how long people live, but how many years they live in good health, free from disability. Japan's HALE is the highest in the world, at nearly 74 years. That means the average Japanese worker can expect nearly 3/4 of a century of active, functional life. They're working into their 70s not out of desperation, but because they're physically and mentally capable. In China, the data is murkier, but estimates put China's HALE somewhere in the low to mid-60s. That's a decade less of healthy lifespan than Japan. And it's getting worse, not better. Walk through any major Chinese city and you'll see why. The obesity epidemic that took decades to unfold in the West has hit China in fast forward. Diabetes rates are exploding. Air pollution in major cities is at levels that would trigger emergency protocols anywhere else. The healthcare system is overwhelmed, uneven, and riddled with corruption. Here's the brutal reality. China is going to have hundreds of millions of elderly people who are both economically dependent and physically unwell, supported by a shrinking workforce that's less productive than its competitors. That's not a demographic transition. That's a humanitarian and economic crisis waiting to happen. Some optimists argue that China can follow the Japanese model, embrace automation, keep workers employed longer, increase female labor participation. It's a nice thought. It's also completely divorced from reality. First, culture matters. Japan's elderly stay in the workforce because of deep cultural emphasis on contribution and purpose. Japanese society reveres work as a form of dignity. In China, the CCP spent decades dismantling traditional culture and replacing it with party loyalty and materialistic ambition. You can't just flip a switch and create a culture of lifelong employment. Second, automation requires innovation, and innovation requires freedom. Japan is a free market democracy with strong intellectual property protections and a culture that rewards entrepreneurship. Chinese companies are world-class at copying and scaling, but genuine innovation? That requires the ability to fail, question authority, and think independently, all things the CCP actively suppresses. Look at robotics. Japan has been the global leader for decades. Companies like Fanuc, Kawasaki, and Yaskawa dominate industrial automation. China has poured billions into robotics development, but they're still playing catch-up, relying heavily on imported components and stolen IP. Third, women's labor participation. Japan managed to increase female workforce participation through policy reforms and cultural evolution. In China, the CCP recently started pushing traditional gender roles again, urging women to have more babies and stay home. You can't simultaneously tell women to join the workforce and return to traditional motherhood. Well, you can, but it doesn't work. Here's where the China hawks in the audience might expect me to say, and they can't use immigration to solve it. Actually, that's not quite right. China could theoretically open its borders to foreign workers, but they won't. China's entire national identity is built on ethnic Han supremacy. The CCP's legitimacy rests on being the defender of Chinese civilization against foreign influence. The idea of importing tens of millions of foreign workers, which is what they'd need, is politically impossible. Even the modest immigration that does happen is tightly controlled and temporary. Foreign workers in China exist in a precarious legal status, subject to arbitrary enforcement and discrimination. There's no pathway to citizenship, no integration, no long-term solution. Here's where this stops being an academic discussion about birth rates and becomes a matter of national security and global stability. China's demographic crisis puts a ticking clock on Xi Jinping's ambitions. If the CCP is going to achieve its goals, reunification with Taiwan, dominance over the South China Sea, displacement of the US as regional hegemon, it has to do so within the next decade or two, before the demographic collapse becomes undeniable. This makes China more dangerous, not less. A rising power is patient, a declining power is desperate, and desperate powers take risks. Look at Russia. Putin's invasion of Ukraine wasn't a sign of strength. It was the action of a leader who sees his window closing, both personally and nationally. Xi Jinping is facing the same calculation. Taiwan isn't going to get easier to take in 2035 when China has 100 million fewer working-age adults. The economic implications are equally profound. China has been the world's factory for 3 decades. That model depends on cheap, abundant labor. That labor force is shrinking and aging. Wages are rising. Companies are already moving production to Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh. The great reshoring and friendshoring is happening right now. Global supply chains built around China's demographics are going to break. Not might break, but are going to break. The countries that adapt first will have enormous advantages. There's a deeper point here that gets overlooked in the sterile language of economic forecasts. Authoritarian systems are uniquely poorly suited to manage demographic transitions. Democracies are messy, inefficient, and frustrating. They're also adaptive. When Japan's birth rate fell, society had real debates. Policies were tried, some failed, some succeeded. Cultural norms evolved. It was gradual and imperfect, but fundamentally responsive. In China, for decades they enforced the one-child policy with brutal efficiency. Forced abortions, sterilizations, the whole dystopian nightmare. Then, when they realized their mistake, they flipped to a two-child policy, then three-child, and now they're considering penalties for not having children. None of it is working because you can't mandate human reproduction through party directives. You can't legislate away the social and economic forces that make modern urban life incompatible with large families. The CCP's tools are coercion and propaganda. The problem requires persuasion and genuine social support. This is the fundamental weakness of the China model. It can build infrastructure at breathtaking speed, it can mobilize resources for massive projects, but it cannot create the social trust, cultural resilience, and institutional flexibility needed to navigate a demographic transition. So what? Why should we care about China's demographic problems? Because the next 20 years of geopolitical competition will be defined by who adapts to the post-population growth world better. And right now, we're not taking it seriously enough. We need to understand that China's apparent strength, its massive population, its manufacturing base, its economic growth, is built on a foundation that's crumbling. The conventional wisdom that China will inevitably surpass the US as the dominant global power is based on projections that don't account for demographic reality. But we can't be complacent. China's decline doesn't automatically mean Western success. We have our own demographic challenges, our own social fractures, our own dysfunction. The question isn't whether China will falter, it will. The question is whether we'll be in a position to maintain leadership. This means investing in things that give Japan its resilience: education, healthcare, automation, social cohesion. It means immigration reform that brings in talent and workers. It means innovation policy that keeps us ahead in AI, robotics, and biotechnology. Most importantly, it means seeing clearly, not through the rose-colored glasses of engagement-era optimism, nor through the lens of knee-jerk hostility, but with clear-eyed realism about what's actually happening in China. Japan isn't the cautionary tale. China is. Japan entered its demographic transition as a wealthy, stable democracy with social capital and technological sophistication to adapt to it. It has managed the transition better than almost anyone predicted. Japanese society functions, innovation continues, quality of life remains high. China is entering the same transition as a low-income authoritarian state with a repressive government, a shallow social safety net, and mounting internal contradictions. The party's legitimacy has been based on delivering economic growth and rising living standards, but what happens when that stops? We're about to find out, and the answer will shape the rest of this century. The demographic disaster unfolding in China isn't a bug in their system. It's a feature of authoritarian governance meeting the realities of modern development. You can't force people to have children. You can't dictate your way out of a fertility crisis. And you can't maintain your great power status with a collapsing population and a broken social contract. Japan's lost decades are starting to look pretty good compared to what's coming for China. Maybe it's time we stopped using Japan as a punchline and started recognizing it for what it is: a successful case study in managing demographic decline with grace, innovation, and social stability. In China, they're about to give us a masterclass in how not to do it. Pay attention.